Ignition sequence start. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Liftoff. We have a liftoff.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Schriever Spacepower series. I'm General Kevin Chilton, Explorer Chair for the Spacepower Advantage Center of Excellence at Mitchell Institute for Aerospace Studies. The Indo-Pacific region is one of the most important in the world. It contains over half the world's population and 60% of global GDP. Countries like China, Japan, South Korea, Australia, and India, and of course Taiwan, are all key players in the world economy. Destabilizing behavior by countries like China and North Korea have put at risk the idea of a free and open Indo-Pacific region. This competition increasingly extends to the space domain. We've witnessed China's rapid rise as a space power. North Korea has also begun deploying its first few spy satellites, likely with Russia's help. These developments have profound implications for regional stability, global security, and the future of responsible space utilization. In November 2022, the United States formally recognized the critical role of space in this theater and established U.S. Space Forces Indo-Pacific. This component command of INDOPACOM is dedicated to integrating space capabilities and effects into joint military operations and working closely with allies and partners to ensure a free and open Indo-Pacific. Given the importance of this command to the future of the Indo-Pacific region, I'm thrilled to have its first and current commander, Brigadier General Anthony Mastalir, join us today. General Mastalir, congratulations, first of all, on your command. I know you've had it for a while. I imagine you started with a telephone, a desk, and a flag, and have had to build the command from there. But so we're all anxious to hear about the progress you've made and the challenges you think you face. And before we get into questions, I'd like to give you a chance to provide some opening remarks to our audience.
General Chilton, I can't tell you how excited I am to be here. Thank you. Thank the Mitchell Institute. All the continued advocacy that we receive, our airmen and guardians downrange, absolutely depend on this kind of support out of Washington, D.C. So you being here and having us, allowing us to spend a few minutes talking about the great things that Space Forces Indo-Pacific is doing in support of the priorities, the objectives of INDOPACOM. It's a real pleasure, and it's the most important thing that I'm doing today. So
great to have you.
You know, there's 385,000 joint warfighters in INDOPACOM, led by Admiral Paparo, who took command just earlier this year. And Space Forces Indo-Pacific as a component works side by side with PAC Fleet, with MAR4PAC, with PAC-AF, SOC-PAC, and USER-PAC as one of the components supporting those joint warfighters and supporting the allies and partners that we have in the region. You know, our mission is pretty simple. It's integrated space operations to preserve a free and open Indo-Pacific. Now, in your opening, you made some comments about the importance of a rules-based international order, which is the foundation of a free and open Indo-Pacific. And why is that important? Because since the end of World War II, when we put in place the rules-based international order, we have collectively enjoyed relative 80 years of peace in terms of war relative to what we saw in World War II. During that time, we saw 70 new democracies spring up. We saw the beginning of the end of colonialism. We saw economic trade, like you pointed out, spread through globalization. We saw an increase in life expectancy. We saw millions pulled out of poverty. And quite frankly, we saw prosperity for every nation that chose to participate. And that rules-based international order is so critical, but it's one that requires continued maintenance. So in Space Forces Indo-Pacific, we look to integrate across all of the other components to ensure that we maintain a free and open Indo-Pacific. Now, one of the reasons that's important is you have bad actors in the area that are specifically looking to disrupt that order through illegal, coercive, aggressive, and deceptive actions. When you look at the things that are happening in the PRC specifically, with respect to exclusive economic zones, with respect to air defense identification zones based on national integrity, sovereign territory. When you look at the unsafe practices of the Coast Guard, of their Air Force, what you see is a continued effort to undermine the rules-based order. And earlier this week, we had the USS Higgins and the HMCS Vancouver steamed through the Taiwan Strait. And why is that important? Because those are international waters. And because international waters are governed by law and a rules-based order. And maintaining that and sending that signal to all that that is what the US military, along with our allies and partners, are going to continue to uphold is very important. Now let's talk a little bit more about space and why Space Forces Indo-Pacific is there. Well, put simply, when the Space Force stood up December 20th, 2019, and we're looking forward to our 5-year birthday celebration here in about a month and a half. When the Space Force stood up, we took a hard look at how are we going to present capabilities, how are we going to present forces to combatant commands. And it made sense that if you want to normalize operations, you're going to present those capabilities, those forces in a component, just like all the other services do. So Space Forces Indo-Pacific, as you mentioned, General Chilton, was the first to stand up in the priority theater, where the consequences, I would argue, are most dire. We've continued to grow. We started with just 20 Guardians that we carved out of PACAF. Prior to the activation of the Space Force, when the Air Force had the space mission, we placed space operators in the air component. And many times those operators worked alongside airmen in the AOC. But today, we are there to support all domains and to integrate seamlessly so that every opportunity, activity, and investment that takes place can benefit from all domain operations, which is exactly what we need to do as we prepare for the potential of great power competition. Let me stop there because I'm going to have a lot of comments about space superiority, about the roles and the interaction between Space Force Indo-Pacific, U.S. Space Command, our battle buddies at Space Forces Space, which is the component to U.S. Space Command, and the rest of the space enterprise. But I suspect I'm going to get a lot of questions along those lines. So I recommend we just jump in and start taking
Sounds good to me. Sounds good to me. Well, it's a great opportunity to explain how you fit into the INDOPACOM command structure, but also how you coordinate with other regional combatant commands as well as U.S. Space Command, that component or that combatant command who's responsible for everything above 100 kilometers. So, you mentioned North Korea as a challenge. China is the biggest challenge, but oftentimes people forget Russia's in your area of responsibility as well. They have up in the Kamchatka Peninsula, that area of the Western Pacific. So you really have three potential adversaries there that could end up collaborating together. As you look at that, what do you see as some of your top operational challenges as you try to plan and posture your team to be prepared for whatever eventuality in the future, and what kind of strategies you're thinking about?
Yeah. So you're absolutely right to point out not just the fact that Russia, the PRC, and North Korea are in the AOR, but that there is evidence of collaboration, and we have not seen that before. So that's very disconcerting. But one of the things that we watch very closely, for example, is what lessons learned we can discern from the illegal war that's going on in Ukraine right now with the Russian invasion. If you really think about where we've been in the last 20 years or over the last 20 years, heavily integrated in the CENTCOM AOR, fighting terrorism. And then you look at what we're going to likely face in great power competition should deterrence fail. What you have at stake is a scaling issue. And understanding how you're going to scale from the conflicts that we have faced in the past to one that will likely may include PRC, North Korea, and Russia. So being able to understand not just from, which weapon systems do we need in place, but across the entire paradigm from policy, potential policy friction points, whether it be information sharing with allies and partners, to integrating for counter C5 ISRT operations across multiple domains. And by C5 ISRT, we're talking, of course, command, control, communications, cyber, computer, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, and targeting. The challenge is that the PRC has put a lot of investment into long-range precision strike, specifically to target U.S. and allied forces to prevent any third-party intervention, to deter us outside the second island chain and beyond. And those capabilities, many of them, depend on space. If you want to project power globally, something the U.S. learned decades ago, space is a critical enabler. So understanding how those kill chains are formed and how the PRC closes a kill chain to generate firepower beyond the second island chain with accuracy, with precision, with lethality is the first step in learning how to break that kill chain. And that's what we're studying every day.
They used to say, we don't want to really kind of pick the beehive, if you will, in space because we are so dependent on space capabilities. This would have been 10, 15 years ago. And we said our adversaries were not. But what I'm hearing from you is they are equally dependent with their weapon systems on space capabilities. And so finding ways to interdict their space capabilities could, in fact, neutralize the threats to not just the second island chain, the first island chain, and the entire theater.
Yeah, it's ironic that if you look at some of the writings, the PRC writings, the PLA writings after the Gulf War, calling space the U.S.'s Achilles heel, that our overdependence on space was a vulnerability. But the reality is to project power over great distances, it's very difficult to close those kill chains without space.
Right.
So despite the fact that at one point in time, they recognized it as a vulnerability, they also now have embraced it as a reality of long-range precision strike. So, when we look at kill chains and the role that space plays, it really underscores the need for space superiority, right? So we talk about space superiority in terms of freedom of maneuver. Ensuring that blue space is available, whether it's GPS or missile warning, ISR, weather, all of the capabilities and the space effects that are provided, ensuring that blue space is available for the joint force and the allies and partners, not just during competition, but should we have to transition to crisis or conflict.
Mhm.
And when you're going up against a potential adversary that has demonstrated the ability to negate space, ensuring that you have that protect and defend mission in place is critically important. And U.S. Space Command, if General Whiting's top priority, would suggest, is to ensure that space is available for the joint force when needed. Now, the other aspect of space superiority is protecting the joint force from space-enabled attack. And when we look at the PRC kill chain and their dependency on space, the onus is on the Guardians, working side by side with the joint force and our allies and partners to ensure that we're able to protect the joint force from space-enabled attack. And that's every bit a part of space superiority in my mind.
So holding the adversary's space capabilities at risk, being able to do that is really the key.
Absolutely.
That part of it. Very good. Well, look, you mentioned you started this, you took over this command with a total of 30 people. Over the last 2 years, how's the command changed? And do you have the right amount of people? Do you have the right skill sets? Because the things you just talked about, as far as defending and attacking adversaries' capabilities, that's new. We weren't allowed to even talk about that as even less than a decade ago. And so we haven't been growing those type of war fighters in the Guardian community until we stood up the Space Force. So how's that going?
It's interesting. You're right. It's new, but it's not new to the other domains, right? And for years, decades, is space special? Is space different? When you look at the normalization of operations in the space domain, from a military perspective, I would argue it's really no different than the other domains. Now, having said that, do we have everything that we need today? We're working on it. So the Space Force is still, I think, just under 10,000 uniformed Guardians, and a little over 3% of the DoD's budget. Now, think about that, a domain that is so critical to all the other domains, and only 3%, a little over 3% of the DoD budget. So the Space Force doesn't have the Guardians or the budget that it needs. And you've heard the Secretary talk about that. In terms of, from where I sit, we are still growing. We activated with just a handful of Guardians, and oh, by the way, they were mostly operators, because those were the individuals that we sent forward into the AOCs, into the KAOCs to operate. But when you stand up a component headquarters and you start to integrate, especially during competition, when you're building the plans, when you're bringing the force structure in, so that you can posture the theater for deterrence, and if deterrence fails, to be ready to fight and win, you need a lot of other specialties that in some cases the Space Force doesn't have. I think this audience knows, and you certainly know, that we activated with operators, intel, cyber, developmental engineers, and program manager acquisition types in the officer corps. And so I depend on General Schneider, PACAF commander, commander of the air component in INDOPACOM. I depend on General Schneider, and he's a very gracious host in terms of all of the support that the space component, needs from the air component. And that we're continuing to establish those relationships. The first year, I would kind of characterize it as discovery learning. When you take a group of operators and you say, okay, transform into a headquarters, there's some discovery learning. The rate of discovery learning is decreasing, and that's a good metric. But the demand signal is increasing as we tell our story and as we continue to integrate across the other components, and they learn about what it is Space Force Indo-Pacific brings to the fight. What we're finding is an increased demand signal. So we're trying to grow the component at a pace that at least keeps parity with the demand signal, but the demand signal is increasing rapidly because all of the joint force is very, very quickly learning that if you want to put together a plan, you'd be well advised to have a guardian on that planning team.
Right.
All right. And then of course, as allies and partners become involved, when you look at some of our tier 1 exercises, and I think we'll probably talk more about that, that demand signal continues to grow.
Right. And it's not just your command, right?
That's right. We have, in terms of space components, we were the first. But on the heels of Space Forces Indo-Pacific, we stood up Space Force Cent, in Central Command. We stood up more recently Space URAF supporting EUCOM. Space Force Space was officially activated in between those times, where my battle buddy, Lieutenant General Doug Chess, is the commander. Under the Space for Indo-Pac flag, we have 2 subcomponents. One today, full up, Space Forces Korea, and one in the planning phase, Space Forces Japan. And there's all kinds of excitement, both on Penn and in Japan, about what the Space Force can bring for those allies.
Yeah. All of this seems to argue for increased funding for the Space Force, not just for kit, equipment, if you will, but also for manpower and the appropriate training to help them become a key player in the joint planning process and, God forbid, execution process. That if you show the readiness in the planning and the day-to-day operations, you deter. So
well, and the General, you hit on a key point, the training. So the time to develop the tactics, techniques, and procedures to execute, orbital warfare. It is a new, as you said, we didn't even discuss concepts like orbital warfare when you were the commander of U.S. STRATCOM. But today, we have to, when you think about what's necessary to preserve blue space and to dismantle red space, orbital warfare is front and center. Now, if you don't have the kit and the time to train with it, to develop the tactics, techniques, and procedures, it's a little like delivering an F-35 to a team saying, we're going to put this in the hangar, okay? We don't want you to touch it. We don't want you to fly it around. You've never fought with this, but should we need you, you need to get in and execute with proficiency. And that's not a recipe for success. No. Any commander knows that.
Nor is it a recipe for deterrence, is it?
Correct. Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned our allies in the region. We certainly have some great ones from Australia, South Korea, Japan, and they certainly, well, they're closer to the threat, but they're as interested as we are in maintaining the rules-based order you described because of the prosperity it's provided for all of them and the rest of the world. So can you talk a little bit about how you work with our South Korean, Japanese, and Australian allies in the region?
One of the things Admiral Paparo is, and before him, Admiral Aquilino, one of the points of emphasis is to transition from numerous bilateral engagements and exercises to more multilateral. And because we understand that to really deter, it's the same reason the HMCS Vancouver steamed side by side with USS Higgins through the Strait earlier this week. But if you want to deter, demonstrating on a daily basis with your allies and partners that you're prepared to fight and win a war should you need to is really the ultimate way to deter a war. So that's really important. The interesting thing about Space Force, Space Command, in terms of military operations, is our nation, our partner nations and allies are in different places in their own journey, and we can engage with those partners where they're at, and really kind of bring them along. One of the ways we do that is in our Tier 1 exercises. So Pacific Sentry, is a very, very important exercise for INDOPACOM, command post exercise that we work closely with Australia. And Chris Gardner, the JIFSIC, if you will, the Joint Force Space Component Commander, my equivalent in Australia. Chris and I work very, very closely and exercise through Tier 1 exercises like PAC Sentry. Keen Edge is another one of those, historically with the US and Japan. And this last year, we actually brought Australia into that. So we're starting to build these exercises that have really multilateral play. And Admiral Paparo wants to continue that. When you look at the Freedom Shield and Ulchi Freedom Shield exercises that we do on Penn with the rocks, again, to start bringing all of the components into those exercises, and really start to prepare for how we need to work together. We've been doing that certainly in the other domains for years, and now that space is on the island, on Penn, and soon will be in country in Japan. That'll really further our effort to integrate space into that.
Right. And so let's talk a little bit about those new commands that you just mentioned, U.S. Space Forces Korea and U.S. Space Force Japan. What's the relationship between them and you, and them and the INDOPACOM commander? And how do you coordinate? How do you work together with these commands?
So just to be clear, we're still in the planning phases for Space Forces Japan.
Right.
We're right now my intent is to activate that component before the end of the calendar year.
Okay. All right.
And that's what we have shared with Japan, and they're very excited about the prospects of that. So having a component on Penn is important to support, General LaCamera's day-to-day.
And that's on Peninsula.
On Peninsula.
On Peninsula, in South Korea.
In South Korea.
Gotcha.
Osan is where the headquarters is.
Okay.
Having the component really allows a tighter integration with the other components in U.S. Forces Korea. That commander, John Patrick, who just took command this last year, by the way, with tons of experience working NATO space, which is why I went after him to get him into, because he understands how coalitions and alliances, work together. He took command this past summer, and now he reports, he's my direct report. So, and we're going to put the same construct in place in Japan, when we activate. They'll report to the commander of Space Forces Indo-Pacific. But having them in place really helps drive that level of integration, not just with the other components, but with the ally. So as both Korea and Japan look to develop their space capabilities, and they have, I would say, aggressive plans to develop military operations where the space domain is concerned. It allows us to, what we call like integrated by design. All right. So as they build their capabilities, having a component right there in country, working with them, having them exercise with us is really great awareness for how they might consider building those capabilities so that they can integrate across the joint force.
Right. I would argue that space is a little more complicated than so. I think everybody knows U.S. Forces Korea has a four-star commander. It's a joint command. Their job is to work with the South Koreans to defend the South Korean peninsulas from any aggression from the north. And now we're seeing this stand-up of a similar type organization that really wasn't combat focused or defense focused in Japan. And Army, Navy, Air Force, the terrestrial forces, they need to be able to plan for those specific AORs. You don't want that planning done all the way back in Hawaii, but Hawaii has to be the main integrator of INDOPACOM, the whole region. Theirs is a local fight, except for space, because space is global. And so I could imagine that an activity or a thing that someone would want to do in U.S. Forces Korea on the peninsula to protect their forces by doing a space strike, for example, is something that INDOPACOM would be interested in as an umbrella. So it seems to me like the relationship between your command at INDOPACOM headquarters and these regional space commands that are supporting four-star generals in their region is going to be a little more important than you would see for the terrestrial commands. Is that fair?
Yeah, no, I think it is. And just like we work very closely with U.S. Space Command to make sure anything, from a regional perspective is deconflicted and properly synchronized with General Whiting's priorities and objectives. That is the same at a slightly smaller scale in Korea, and likewise will be in Japan. I think sometimes I think there's this false premise, and you didn't say it, but I've heard some say it, that these forces are here for this conflict, as if the conflict is going to be isolated and is not going to expand. Certainly, that would be the desire, but when you look at a lot of the different scenarios that we'd be facing in the Indo-Pacific, whether through opportunism or coordination, the fact that we may have multiple players in the fight, I think, is something we have to be aware of.
Absolutely. I think in the past, we kind of looked at it in the stovepipe.
We did.
But now we've got a broader scope.
And that's one of the reasons why I think we're trying to break down some of these, bilateral exercises and start making them more multilateral.
Right.
Because all of those nations, and you think about Japan and South Korea specifically, think about where they were, in terms of their own development as a nation at the conclusion of World War II and where they are today. I mean, it's absolutely amazing. So they of course have a vested interest in preserving a free and open Indo-Pacific.
Absolutely. Australia has been a great partner for decades, particularly in providing parts of their country to bolster space domain awareness, because geography matters, as it turns out. When it comes, you have to be in the right place looking up in the sky to be able to really understand what's going on in space. Do you foresee Japan and perhaps South Korea also allowing for space forces, space surveillance capabilities being placed in their countries?
Yeah, I think they're going to insist upon it, quite frankly. Whether it's a sovereign capability
that they'll contribute.
So, DARC is a great example, the deep space radar that we're going to put in Australia. It was interesting as we worked through the process with DARC. It was an exercise talisman saber, where high levels of the Australian government got to see firsthand what Space Force Indo-Pacific Guardians were doing in Australia as part of this exercise. And it was just a few days later that we were all full speed ahead on DARC, right? It's just understanding the contributions that space makes and being able to physically go there and see what the operations look like made a huge difference for the policymakers. So that's really important. Space domain awareness underpins everything we do in space. No other domain would a commander tolerate the lack of domain awareness that historically we've seen in the space domain.
Absolutely.
And part of it is scale, right? When you think about 100 kilometers to dot.
Yep.
Part of it is scale, but the other part of it, like you said, is geography and access, and that's where partnerships are really, really important. Being able to, and this is where our commercial, we have a lot of commercial representatives in the audience, and this is a place where through the Joint Commercial Operations Cell that BARP Gulf and U.S. Space Command has been putting together, we've seen really great opportunities for allies to understand space domain awareness, contribute to space domain awareness. You don't have to be able to launch build a satellite, build a rocket, launch it, and operate it to be a spacefaring nation.
Right.
Thanks to the U.S. commercial industry.
Right.
And a lot of our allies and partners are taking advantage of that. Very excited about commercial operations from a JCO perspective as a concept. In fact, it was just a couple weeks ago that the ROCs signed a letter of intent to join that, to join JCO. So we see continued interest in space domain awareness, which is important because right now we use Keplerian physics to derive an orbit determination. When you look at dynamic space operations, where satellites are constantly maneuvering, that becomes even more difficult. So having those sensors in place, whether they're terrestrial based or space based, is really important.
Right. Of course, they'll still be guided by Kepler, but they'll be maneuvering into new orbits, and that's won't happen soon, but it's going to happen eventually. We'll have better propulsive satellites on orbit, I'd say.
Better propulsive, on space refueling, likely in the future, different types of propulsion. So I think we just have to, I agree, this isn't a tomorrow problem.
Yeah.
But we can't ignore the fact that we have to be able to achieve space domain awareness both today and be prepared for the future.
It'd be nice to be ahead of it. Exactly. So let's continue talking a little bit about coordination between commands. So if you envision a conflict in the Western Pacific, when any activity that's taken in space is going to affect every other regional combatant command around the world. So you've already alluded to General Whiting's role as the U.S. Space Command commander, who has the authority and responsibility for everything above 100 kilometers. Talk a little bit about how that coordination would happen if you see the Chinese, for example, are being successful in prosecuting attacks against our naval forces or land forces or air forces, and that you see an opportunity to take out a particular space capability, or there be ground jamming a link or actually destroying a satellite. How will that work? I mean, how will you work from INDOPACOM, between INDOPACOM and U.S. Space Command, to make sure everybody gives a head nod and doesn't create collateral effects that are not intended?
Yeah. So it starts with having Guardians embedded in the planning process prior, right? So when you think about, counter C5 ISRT, which is one of the key elements to Admiral Paparo's Prevail plan, you really have to take into account all of the capabilities, whether it's space or cyber, or air, maritime, land, to understand what that looks like. And then the key is the timing and tempo of how you prosecute those operations. And the adversary gets a vote, right? So this is where being able to synchronize across the two combatant commands is so important. And having the Space Force Indo-Pacific Guardians working closely with Space Force Space Guardians at a component-to-component level, so that everyone understands this is the plan, This is the terrestrial schema maneuver.
Mhm.
These are the priorities and objectives. And you start from a common understanding of how you're going to fight. And then it's making sure that you have the C2 connectivity survivable, resilient, so that if one node goes down, another node can continue.
Right.
So that you can maintain that synchronization. And that's really important, because there's a lot of organizations with equities, all right, across the joint force, with our allies and partners, and being able to coordinate and then synchronize is something that, you know, we have to be able to do in real time. Understanding that, you know, with fog and friction and a denied environment, it's going to be even more difficult.
Right. And it's not just your command and U.S. Space Command. You got to be talking, I would think, almost daily in a conflict, certainly with European space, with Central Command space, because the effect you may need to eliminate a space-based reconnaissance capability that's giving you trouble may originate out of Europe, or it may originate out of Central Command, or off a ship in the Persian Gulf, or it could be anywhere in the world that you can attack space, because these assets go over every place in the world.
That's right.
And so coordinating that, it just seems even more complicated than any other domain that we've ever had to deal with in planning, exercising, and God forbid, warfighting.
Yeah. Yeah. The challenge is to be able to coordinate it, you know, with those other domains. Whereas historically, we've been very good about coordinating with the air component.
Right.
Now, INDOPACOM is, you know, some would argue a maritime environment, and certainly the air component plays a really, really important role, as does the land component. But being able to integrate to ensure that the U.S. Navy understands when they can steam into the second island chain, and have confidence that the Space Force Guardians, both at Space Force Indo-Pac and at U.S. Space Command, have done the job to ensure that we're protecting them from space-enabled attack. That's ultimately what we have to achieve.
Right.
And that's what we're building toward.
Great. You have to worry about your assets as well, too, or U.S. Space Command does, that support you. The threats that one would worry about, I think, against our satellite capabilities that our terrestrial warfighters depend upon, can come from land, direct descent ASAT. They can come from lasers on land, or those could be on aircraft or ships. Direct descent could come off a ship.
Yep.
Do you feel like your command is getting the intelligence and space-based reconnaissance support you need to give you the indications and warning to let you know that, hey, they've rolled out a direct descent ASAT, it's on the pad, they're prepping it, so that you can take preemptive activity, or at least posture your forces, or U.S. Space Command can posture satellites, et cetera, to be prepared and not be surprised?
Yeah. I think that we are in the process of better utilizing commercial capabilities where that is concerned. I mean, there is no question that our, you know, national capabilities are the best in the world, right? Nobody comes close.
Correct.
And bringing commercial and understanding when, you know, is it appropriate and sufficient to use commercial products is really a key emphasis of the commercial space policy that General Saltzman signed out. And this is something that we're continuing to work with both NGA and, you know, the users in INDOPACOM, because there's a lot of capability and a lot of capacity that other companies can bring.
Directly to you.
Directly.
Right.
Absolutely.
It's where timeliness is more important than resolution in many cases.
Sometimes timeliness, in many cases, sometimes releasability is an issue. You know, a great example, and it's not just for the Joint Force, but even our partners in Hawaii, right? So during some recent Maui wildfires, not the devastating one, but some since then. Maui County Fire has reached out to us and said, "Hey, could we get some images?" and gave us what they're looking for. And through our commercial sources, we're very quickly to bring those products to the fire chief in Maui County. And he was like, "Wow, this is really helpful," right?
Yeah. And that's what you need.
When you think about disaster response, humanitarian assistance, there's some no-brainers there. We did the same thing with Japan after the Tokyo earthquakes. So or after the Japan earthquakes, there is evidence that the Space Force component in that AOR with access to those commercial contracts can provide value.
Right.
Now, what is the final process look like? We're still in a pilot to better understand that, and we're working closely with NGA, to understand that.
Right.
But make no mistake, this idea that a lot of times we'll hear, well, all the combatant command's needs are met. Those are not all of the components that have needs even get those requirements up to the point where they can be, there's just a priority scheme.
Right.
And the reality is there are some, underserviced customers at lower levels within the combatant command. And we found those folks because we're working side by side with them.
Yeah.
And we're saying, well, maybe you're not going to get your request adjudicated through the J2C because it's not the priority at the combatant command level, but it's important for you. So let's see if there's another way, that we can meet that requirement.
Right. Just bring it direct into the headquarters as opposed to filtering it through various analysis.
Yeah. So we're exploring this through a pilot, and we're going to continue to work with both Space Systems Command, who is largely running the pilot with our input, and with NGA. To see what that looks like, to get the right answer for the joint force. Because ultimately, that's what my focus is.
Great. Well, listen, before we go to questions, I'd like to just give you a shot at talking about what you looking forward. And when your time ends up, you're always thinking about teeing up the next commander and the next. What do you see? How do you see your command moving forward here over the next 3 to 5 years?
Yeah. Well, certainly want to get Space Forces Japan up and running, this year. That'll be a big one, because the more opportunity, when there's an opportunity to meet an ally or a partner, and you gain some traction with them and some direction, and now you have funds from others that are investing into this domain. That's really critical. We have to leverage those opportunities. So continuing to integrate, with our allies and partners, and really bringing more countries in. We have a few countries, obviously Japan, Korea, Australia are the big ones. India has a significant space capability. And then there's other countries that aren't as advanced, but in terms of space capability, but they want to contribute, right? So we're looking for those partners and continue to develop. Working through the C2, right? How are we going to execute the C2 at scale? And to your point, ensure that we have those actions synchronized across multiple stakeholders with equities to include U.S. Space Command that has that very global mission.
Right.
So we have a great relationship with U.S. Space Command and Space Force Space, and that is continuing to evolve. I'm really excited as the component matures that we'll be able to take on more of what I would call, a regional focus. When you look at some of the capabilities that we have in theater that don't belong to the component, but then you say, well, why is that? Well, the component didn't exist when we put those capabilities there.
Right.
And General Saltzman has challenged us as we go through the maturation process to better understand what should be aligned under the space component. So there is a lot of work to do in that area, and working very close with Space Force COO Lieutenant General Burt, who's our biggest advocate, and the rest of the space staff to understand how is this component going to grow in terms of responsibility within the Space Force, and then continue to strengthen those relationships with U.S. Space Command. It's really exciting. We don't have all the answers right now, but we have the right people working on the problem set. So I'm confident we'll get there.
That's great. If it was easy, anybody could do it. Well, that's great. General Mastalir, let's take the remainder of our time to let our audience offer their questions. And just a reminder, don't forget to unmute your mic. And it's really helpful if you'll identify yourself and your organization when you present your question. And Aidan will be, as usual, running the show in the background to make sure we have an orderly set of questions asked. So Aidan, over to you.
First, we have Greg Hadley with Air and Space Forces magazine.
Hi, General Mastalir. Thank you for doing this. I wanted to ask about something you mentioned pretty early on, which was the evidence of collaboration between Russia, North Korea, and China. Could you speak a little bit more about that? And as you try and foster, the U.S. partnerships in the region, what are you seeing from that partnership in opposition?
Yeah, thanks for that, Greg. This is we discussed earlier about, and historically there's been a tendency to view in a silo some of these potential conflicts and how we're going to operate, and really as we start to see what's happening in the Ukraine with Russia, the potential involvement of North Korea, and we've seen South Korea come out publicly and denounce that support, and where the PRC is, it's something that we have to be incredibly watchful to understand what level of collaboration is taking place. So that's really important. North Korea continues to violate international law with their illegal missile testing, and the extent to which that technology is being transferred to others is something that we watch very carefully. So it is something that is on our watch list, and I know our intelligence specialists are watching very closely so we can better understand those relationships.
Right. Yeah. When I was a young officer assigned in Japan and Korea, we looked at the possibility of a Korean conflict just as a Korean conflict. We can't do that anymore, is your point, right?
Yeah.
Thanks. Next question, please.
Next, we have Stephen Clark from Ars Technica.
Hi, General. Can you hear me?
I can. Hey, Stephen.
Hey, thank you. Stephen Clark, Ars Technica. The question, just what you're seeing from China, from their emerging space capabilities. I was wondering if you could identify, one or two areas that give you the most concern or maybe keep you up at night. Is it ISR? Is it this new proliferated constellation that they've started to deploy that's kind of similar to Starlink? Is it anti-satellite capability that they may be developing? Just kind of your assessment of the threats from China, and what, if you can pull out one or two to talk about, that would be great. Thank you, sir.
Sure. Yes, you did a great job of highlighting the challenge, because all of those are disconcerting. One of the advantages of having a component that sometimes we gloss over, but it's really become evident in some of the exercises, is that if there is say, for example, a directed energy capability that is causing issues to the space domain, and certainly one that General Whiting would prefer is not, taking a shot at, his satellites. That's something where the coordination with the terrestrial warfighters, if you will, in terms of how can we neutralize that target? That's having the Guardians on the ground, working closely with the other components, and a voice at the table, so that when the commanders get together and Admiral Paparo or the Joint Force Commander, whomever that is in the scenario, that the space commander can come and say, hey, this is a priority. We have got to find a way to neutralize it. I don't have the capability, perhaps, to do that from space or with space capabilities. I need help from the other domains, right? From my battle buddies and the air component.
And maybe even another region of the world.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Maybe another country,
right?
Where those relationships as they grow and build capability, having Guardians working side by side, understanding that, hey, there's this capability that you can neutralize, and we need your help doing that. U.S. Space Command General Whiting certainly is very focused on China's counter space capabilities that are designed to take out U.S. satellites, as are we, because we need to know if those blue capabilities go away, and what is the impact to the blue kill chain should that happen. But there are other ground-based, like we've seen China tests start. Let's go back to 2007. Right. With a direct ascent ASAT. And we know that they're continuing to build out those capabilities. And in some cases, again, we have to go back to the commanders here in INDOPACOM and say, this is a problem, because if we can't neutralize that weapon system, you're going to lose space capability upon which you depend. And really bring that to the forefront of the targeting process in terms of priority, in terms of decisions that are made about how to allocate resources for the operation. That's the value of having a commander, not just a director of space forces embedded in the AOC, but a commander of U.S. Space Forces Indo-Pacific at the table, bringing that information to the rest of the Joint Force and to those commanders. And then understanding, okay, what are the consequences if we don't take action? What does that look like? And being able to articulate to the Joint Force and that leadership, this is what the degradation of blue space looks like to you. This is what happens to the kill chain of name your long-range precision strike weapon system. Okay. And those Guardians have to be prepared to do that. So thanks for that, Stephen.
We used to just assume space was like oxygen. It was just, all you have to do is take a breath, it'll be there. That's not the case anymore.
Roach, I think
he did. I think he said that. But it reminds me of, you can go back to in history of World War II, before you invade the continent of Europe from England to defeat the Nazis, you first have to secure the North Atlantic. And that was not done with soldiers. It was done with sailors and airmen. So it was those domains. And so to enable victory, I think you're pointing out, making a great point, to enable victory, to deter effectively, you have to be able to defend our space capabilities, and you have to be able to hold the adversary's space capabilities at risk and convince them of that, so that they don't make the fatal mistake of taking on the United States of America, her partners and allies around the world. Well, General Mastalir, we've sadly run out of time.
This has been just getting started.
This has been a great conversation, and we can't thank you enough for taking time out of your schedule to come all the way from Hawaii to be here in DC. I know you have other responsibilities, but we like to think you just came to see us. So thanks for coming and sharing your wisdom with the Mitchell Institute, but also with our audience today. And so, ladies and gentlemen, we appreciate your participation. Wouldn't be a party if you didn't show up as well online. So thanks very much for joining us today, and have a great Space Power Day.
Semper Supra.
There you go.